program is produced under grant number 377-193 from the United States Department of Justice, Office of Law Enforcement Assistance, and is for the in-service training of law enforcement personnel. Wednesday, 3:02 a.m. A burglar, after a telephone call to this residence, makes one last check to make sure that there is no one at home, and then proceeds to a side door to slip the lock with a celluloid strip.
See you tomorrow afternoon, right? Take care of yourself. Okay. Hey, what are you doing in my room? Let go of me! Let me go! Let me go!
Before we start discussing the burglary and assault that we have just seen, let's review some of the points that we raised during our last discussion. When you, the police officer, arrive at a crime scene, what are your duties? 1, to render first aid if needed. 2, to protect and preserve the scene of the crime. When we talk about protecting and preserving the scene of the crime, of course it depends on what one of the three different types of scenes that we are going to investigate. You recollect we discussed the indoor crime scene, the outdoor crime scene, and the crime scene in or about a vehicle. Number one, keep people away. Keep those unauthorized from coming into the building, onto the crime scene, and those in the building away from the crime scene and perhaps outside of the building also. To give you an example, I have in mind a case in which a particularly bad accident occurred and there were 3 deaths. There are always people who are, of course, sensation seekers, who are perhaps have a ghoulish sense, and in this particular case, actually, pieces of bone from the bodies were taken by them and carried away. Or I am thinking of another example where the police officer completed his duty, did it properly, he protected the scene, but as often happens, another police officer who had no connection whatsoever with this particular incident came there, was curious, he was allowed to enter on the scene. It so happened that this was a very apparent suicide. The weapon was alongside the body. The medical examiner had already proclaimed that it appeared to be a suicide. While waiting for the investigators, this particular officer picked up the suicide weapon, carried it a distance of 10 or 12 feet, and placed it on a shelf up against the wall about 7 or 8 foot high. Now you can readily see when the investigators appeared at the crime scene what great difficulty they are going to have. An apparent suicide, the weapon itself at a great distance from the body. Now suppose you were the first police officer to arrive on that scene we saw a few minutes ago. What would you do? First aid, of course. If it is apparent to you, body is lying there with 3 bullet holes right in the center of the forehead, it's reasonable to assume that you have a dead body. You know then that you will have to notify the medical examiner. If, on the other hand, there's a possibility of applying first aid, not too much of an injury, at least to your eye, do apply the first aid. The second thing, and of great importance, of course, is getting the people who are either at the crime scene or about the crime scene outside of the building. But remember, do not allow them to disperse. Request that they remain in one particular spot. However, if there may be several people and possible witnesses, keep them apart if you can so do it. And don't forget also that in all probability the person who originally phoned the complaint in to the police headquarters is also there. And to this person, while you are waiting for the medical examiner, perhaps, or waiting for the investigators to come in, it would be a good opportunity for you, the police officer, to get a running account from him. What exactly did he, the complainant, observe? Did he notice anything unusual about the height or perhaps the shortness of the individual who ran from the house? Can he give a description in regard to the clothing, the color of skin perhaps? Or if there was a vehicle, perhaps he can tell the type of vehicle, the color of the vehicle. With this information, you, the police officer, can instantly radio in to headquarters, and in all probability, the sergeant might decide to issue an APB, an all-points bulletin. Now, if you have done all these things we've mentioned, you know that you have done a complete job as the first officer at the crime scene. Now, you must wait for the investigators. It is at this point that the investigators take over. Remember the first clue, that fingerprint, that footprint? Of course, a footprint. We'll get to the fingerprints later. Instantly, the investigator knows that he needs a technician, a specialist, particularly in the field of moulage. Now, if he, the investigator, is lucky, he is able to call upon the services of a specialist like Lou Cataldo, Deputy Sheriff, Barnstable County, Massachusetts, and Director of the Crime Laboratory and the Sheriff's County School at Barnstable.
Thank you very much, George. We're interested now in footprint and moulage. And as Professor Swidler says, naturally the initial investigating officer is the most important individual, because without him there to protect the scene, the evidence that is found there by the technician could be confused by virtue of having other officers' footprints present, or for that matter, a police cruiser leaving its tracks there, and the technician certainly would have a terrible time to distinguish between what was left by the suspects and those of legitimate footprints at the scene. So therefore, we say that the initial investigating officer certainly is the most important. Then the technician, of course, arrives, and the first thing he does is to photograph that scene, and in it, of course, he includes a measurement stick of either a ruler or a yardstick to get the size of the footprint left at the scene. And now, of course, the technician has got this photograph taken. He's ready for the moulage. And let's explain briefly what a moulage is. Moulage is a very simple thing to do. Matter of fact, it's you ought to try several of these just so that to see just how simple it is. It merely take probably a small bucket or a container of this size, fill it half full of water for an ordinary size footprint of, say, of this size here. And then you take your plaster Paris cast, pour it into the water, not the reverse, but have your water first, pour your plaster Paris cast, plaster Paris in there, and make your cast by taking and stirring the moulage until it reaches the consistency of custard. And then, of course, you pour the consistency into a form that is made to fit the desired footprint to be taken. And before you know it, in a short time, you have it set, and you'll come up with the actual footprint. Now, I'd like to point out, as far as the footprint evidence itself, there's some distinguishing characteristics that are somewhat similar to the very principle of ballistics with the striation of the bullets, as well as fingerprints in the friction ridges. Well, so too, therefore, on a footprint cast, you'll see some distinguishing characteristics. But let's go through four distinguishing things that we look for. First of all, we're interested in the size of the footprint, so that therefore we get an idea of the average height, perhaps, and whether or not there was two sets of footprints left. This tells us a little something to begin with. Then, of course, we look for the pattern. And in the pattern of the actual sneaker print, as this is, you might find some that are completely one pattern. Then, of course, you have on a shoe, perhaps the heel will be different from the sole. All of this, of course, is good area. That's pattern. Then we come, of course, to imperfections. That is to say, the footprint, that is the shoe, could have picked up broken glass or sharp rocks or sharp stones, I should say, inside, which would cut a piece of that footwear so that when the imprint was left, you would have the impression would show the actual opening that was made by that particular thing. So, of course, as far as the cast is concerned, it's absolutely no good unless you get the suspect to compare it with. And I strongly urge that you get a suspect as soon as you possibly can, because naturally the wear and tear, also in tire marks, the same thing occurs there. You make a tire mark cast. If you don't apprehend the suspect as soon as possible, why that tire mark, of course, is going to wear by natural being on the road. Now, don't get discouraged if after making a number of casts that you're not successful in making identification, because the time is going to come when you do, and you'll get a complete satisfaction, as in this particular case, where the only evidence at the crime scene was a footprint. Now, I'd like to point out in this chart several factors. Not only do we have the size, we also have the wear and tear, which shows up both in the footwear and in the actual cast, but we also have a most remarkable identification by virtue of the fact that in the instep is a bent common pin. And if we move over here to the chart, you'll see that impression of the bent common pin has showed up in the plaster Paris cast. Now, it's difficult enough in the best conditions to make a cast, probably, say, soft sand, And it's a little easier, of course, if it's hardened surface. I might point out that this cast was made in the snow. So you see, it can be done. It's simple, so that I think you'd have a lot of fun just trying it. So I'd like to close by merely pointing out, as Professor Swidler says, important that the initial investigating officer is most important there. The fact that to see to it that he doesn't allow anyone to add anything to that crime scene. And of course, above all, not to destroy any evidence.
While the moulage expert is doing his work, the photographers are taking the picture, and again I remind you, counterclockwise and clockwise, the overall scene. The investigator is scanning the room very carefully in the same manner, and sketches are being made. Entering into the room itself, of course, noticeable instantly is a body, and in the clasp of the body in one hand is a piece of cloth. Now this cloth, when properly removed and looked over, evidently comes from a man's shirt, probably torn from the collar down to the waist. Much can be done with fibers and cloth of this type. When properly processed at the laboratory, eventually the type of fiber or hemp, the mill that used it, that wove it, the parties that purchased it, the jobbers, the wholesalers, and finally the retailers. It's a long process, but well worthwhile. And you can narrow down almost to the neighborhood and perhaps even the store where the particular shirt was purchased. And in this way, possibly get a valuable clue also. Found on the floor near the body, you will notice a hat. Now, of course, the hat itself, it can be very simple to determine whether it belongs to the victim or to the assailant. A quick check of the hats within the house, for one thing, may disclose that. However, within the hat is also a tag with a number and a name. And of course, this could be a very direct clue to determine where the hat came from, who brought it in, and who took it out. At the same time, in a very high percentage of cases, a person who wears a hat, even a new hat, will pick up some hair naturally from the head. Now, much can be done in the comparison of hairs. Again, in the laboratory, if you have a suspect, identification can be made as to whether that particular hair or hairs within the hat belong to your suspect. On the opposite side of the body was noticed some glass fragments and what appeared to be blood stains. The glass appears also to be rather thick and curved. Now, in the field of glass and glass fractures, much can be done. Frankly, I've seen more done in this particular field than perhaps any other field as to identification and, of course, as to many other clues. And I don't intend to go into that in some detail. In regard to the blood stains, however, the paramount question here is, one, is it blood? Number two, whose blood is it? Is it the blood of the victim or the blood of the assailant? The blood typing, and of course, again, a comparison with a suspect at the proper time to determine whether it is the same type of blood. On the fifth slide, which is, of course, a dresser, you may have wondered why I haven't mentioned fingerprints, except for that one slight time, during this discussion of the handling of evidence. After all, there would seem to be lots of opportunities to find fingerprints on such items as the ransacked drawer. The reason is that I feel a little self-conscious talking on this subject when there is someone here with a knowledge that comes from years of experience as Superintendent of the Mass State Bureau of Education, Bob Roth. He is at present a professor at Northeastern University in the Department of Law Enforcement.
You did notice in the slides that there were fingerprints. You saw the offender touch objects in the scene. I'd like to address myself to you as an officer first arriving at the scene, or perhaps to you as an investigator. Understand that we have read in the manual, sometimes fingerprints are overemphasized as evidence. And I'm not here to convince you that I should overemphasize any particular aspect of identification, but draw from it this parallel. Fingerprints have been found in many areas. You, as the investigator, must be aware of where they can be found, but most of all, how they might help you in your investigation. You saw the drawer that was touched. I'd like to call your attention to a particular case that actually figured in the solution by pointing out to you here a kitchen drawer. This was a kitchen drawer that contained ordinary utensils, and in this particular space was the knife that became the murder weapon. Down here, if you will, notice the drawer pull, and on this curved surface in the back is where the fingerprint was retrieved. You might not believe it, but being able to retrieve a fingerprint from that area produced this enlargement, and in this instance, this is the curvature of the drawer pull. These are marks drawn to the characteristics that establish the identification of the offender. Would you have found this on the back of the drawer pull? I wonder. But understand that we have had fingerprints in many strange locations. I draw your attention to one more print. Since we can find them on cloth, not ordinarily, not all the time, but it is possible. Since we can find them on skin, and I wonder if that startles you. Maybe you haven't seen the textbooks that have indicated that this is a fact. But here, if you will, is an arm. This is a bracelet. And in this area is a perfectly identifiable fingerprint. It's not charted, but I'm sure that you can see on your screen the lines that depict the pore openings, the configuration of a fingerprint. Now, where do we look? Well, we look anywhere at the scene. The technician is to make a complete examination. You read again in the manual that in many instances you have to compromise. You've got the pressure of time on you. So certainly you go to the obvious. You do try to look for the tool of entry, the location of entry, the weapon, the objects that were sought for, the ones that were discarded. You're looking for fingerprints anywhere. But my message to you is that they don't always tend to convict the offender. They may identify the victim. They may tend to identify a person who was at the scene that you would not otherwise have known. There are many values, and we're not trying to evaluate the evidence at the scene. There are many processes. Certainly you can try field techniques. You might photograph the object because there is a fingerprint already visible. You might further dust or powder, use chemical methods for field research. But the point to be made is you as the investigator or you as the officer at the scene must realize much more can be done back at the laboratory. So we're talking about taking the evidence back for further processing. We're not just talking about everything that you do at the scene and that's the end of your ability. As a matter of fact, we're not suggesting that you would second guess the technician, but you have a role to play. Sometimes you are aware of things or objects that should be examined that the technician arriving at the scene has not had time to ascertain. Why don't you be aware of those? Now, why are we considering even fingerprints to this extent? Again, looking at the manual, we're not trying to overemphasize the fingerprint as such. We're talking about trace evidence. And if you will understand that many of the principles that have been applied to the identification, the comparison of fingerprints are just as applicable to any other type of evidence. You saw the moulage of the footprint. We compare striations of tool marking. We've compared documents. The point I'm trying to make is that some of these are not apparent as you appear at the scene. As the technician, you do not always see what is to be taken away as evidence. Therefore, if we're going to process evidence, give us the chance, give us the time, but give us the cooperation. My message, therefore, is that you are going to try and record this scene so it can be reconstructed. You are going to influence the individuals that are there with your knowledge of the skills of the trade. Certainly as a profession, you've got to be conversant in this as a long-established tool. But most of all, when you turn over your evidence to the technician, you're not turning over your responsibility. It's cooperation. This is a team effort. And therefore, let me suggest to you that you are part of the team. And in that way, together, perhaps as technicians and investigators and members of law enforcement, we can make some progress, if not all solutions, of crime.
Inadvertently, I stated that Bob was a supervisor with the Mass Department of Education. In a way, this is true because he is very well known in the field of law enforcement education. But actually, all of his years of experience have been as supervisor with the Massachusetts Department of Identification. I think that you can see now that the police officer who first arrives at the scene, at the crime scene, need not be a specialist or a technician in any of the fields that we have covered in the process of collecting evidence. It is also evident that he must be well trained in first aid and the necessary steps to protect and preserve the crime scene. Any failure to live up to the steps that we've described could well cost the loss of valuable evidence as well as misleading the investigators.
Police officers who would like to ask questions of today's panel are invited to call, collect if necessary, area code 617-491-5600. The guests on today's panel are Captain James E. Sullivan, Training Director, Worcester Police Academy, Worcester, Massachusetts. Professor Robert Roth, Northeastern University, Department of Law Enforcement Programs, University College. Deputy Sheriff Louis Cadaldo, Director, Barnstable County Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the Barnstable County Police Academy, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And George J. Swidler, Northeastern University, Department of Law Enforcement Programs, University College. The moderator is James P. Kelly, executive producer of the Law Enforcement Training Project.
Thank you. We're back again to that part of the program known as the feedback hour. I'd like to thank our lecturers again, Professor Roth and Professor Swidler, and also Deputy Sheriff Cataldo, a very excellent presentation. There is one question that has come in, and it did seem apparent on the program, Sheriff, that the moldage that you took, or the cast that you took of that footprint was in the snow. Is there any special preparation that's made?
Yes, if I failed to mention, we had a shellac spray that we sprayed in the insert of the area where the cast was to be made.
The shellac spray then solidifies that portion of it and makes
Yes.
it possible for the moldage to take place.
To harden up, yes.
Yes, I'm sure. Betty Crocker will come out with a mix very shortly that'll make a lot of that unnecessary. Is there anything else, incidentally, that is done to, in the continuity or chain of evidence that can be done at that particular time when you're making that moldage?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Jim, because we failed to get in the important fact that on the face of the moulage, that is to say, the part that's staring you when you get through mixing and pouring that moulage into its position of the cast, before it sets, you take a sharp scribe, perhaps maybe a bent twig, and just simply mark on there before it sets the crime, the place of the crime, the date, and also your initials. These are all good things to put in to preserve the continuity and also for identification in court later on.
Incidentally, I think a point that could be brought out here is that the use of the fingerprints, which Professor Roth so eloquently described, and the moolage, does two things. It helps trace a suspect, but it also can clear an innocent person, too. Isn't that correct?
Very much so, yes. And there are many instances where we're not at all concerned with to whom they belong, and we find out that they, in the end, do clear an individual. Yes.
I guess you found that out, too, Professor Swidler, in your Army career.
Of course, when you have a great number of possible suspects, these things help to cut them down without any question whatsoever. The same with the other objects, for instance, the hair. It's not easy to make the comparison, but it can be done very definitely.
That applies also to another one of your capabilities, that polygraph work, used to eliminate suspects as well as to find them.
Well, of course, the polygraph...
which is a whole new lecture in itself.
It's a complete field.
Question for Sheriff Cataldo. When you photograph an impression like the footprint on the program, I know you should include a ruler in the photo for scale. Are there other things to keep in mind in doing these photos? Do you follow the same rules, for example, for fingerprint photos?
Not necessarily for